David was an experienced taxi driver in the busy streets of the city. He had been driving his yellow cab for over 10 years and had met all kinds of people. Polite customers, talkative ones, those who loved to share their life stories, and even some who were too busy on their phones to say a word. David loved his job despite the challenges. He saw himself as more than just a driver. He was a helper, a listener, and sometimes even a guide. One sunny afternoon, David received a ride request from an upscale neighborhood. He pulled up in front of a large, elegant house, and a middle-aged woman walked out briskly. Her name was Karen. She had a neat professional appearance, with her blonde hair tied back and sunglasses covering her eyes. Karen opened the back door and sat down without a word. David greeted her warmly, as he did with all his passengers. "Good afternoon, ma'am. Hope you're having a great day. Where are you headed?" Karen didn't reply immediately. She adjusted her purse and gave him the address with a curt tone. "Just drive," she said. David smiled politely and started the meter. The car moved smoothly through the traffic, and David tried to create a friendly atmosphere. It was his nature to make people feel comfortable, no matter their mood. "Looks like it's going to be a beautiful day," David said, glancing at the bright blue sky through the windshield. Karen shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her arms crossed tightly. "I'd rather not talk," she said sharply, her voice carrying a hint of irritation. David immediately backed off, focusing on the road. "Of course, ma'am." "No problem," he said, keeping his tone respectful. The silence in the car grew heavy. Karen's eyes darted around nervously. She clutched her purse tightly, and every time David looked in the rearview mirror to check the traffic, she tensed. David noticed her discomfort but chose not to say anything. He had met passengers like this before, people who just wanted to get to their destination without any interaction. As they approached her destination, David slowed down at a red light. A street vendor walked past the car, offering cold drinks to drivers stuck in traffic. David smiled at the vendor, shaking his head politely to decline. The man waved and moved on. "Do you always talk to strangers?" Karen suddenly asked, her voice colder than before. David was taken aback, but kept his calm. "I believe a little kindness goes a long way," he replied. Karen didn't respond, but her expression hardened. She sat back in her seat, her face tight with disapproval. When they finally arrived at her destination, Karen got out of the car quickly and slammed the door without a word of thanks. David watched as she marched into a building, shaking his head slightly but saying nothing. He had learned long ago not to take such behavior personally. As he drove away, David didn't realize that this short ride would soon turn his life upside down. David returned to his usual routine after dropping Karen off. The day was like any other, with rides to the airport, a busy market, and even a cheerful family heading to the zoo. He enjoyed meeting people and being a part of their everyday lives, even if only for a few minutes. Little did he know, trouble was brewing from the ride he had thought nothing of. Meanwhile, Karen entered her office building, still tense from her taxi ride. Her coworkers greeted her warmly, but Karen's mind was elsewhere. She couldn't shake the feeling of discomfort she had felt in the cab. She began replaying the ride in her head, focusing on every detail, even exaggerating some. By the time she sat at her desk, she had convinced herself that David's politeness was suspicious. During lunch, Karen told a few of her colleagues about the ride. "The driver kept looking at me through the mirror," she said, frowning. "It made me so uncomfortable." One of her coworkers, a younger woman named Mia, asked carefully, "Did he say anything inappropriate?" Karen paused, hesitating, before saying, "Well, not really. But I could feel it. His tone, his questions. It was just off." Another coworker chimed in, "You should report it. Better safe than sorry." Karen nodded slowly, convincing herself that she was doing the right thing. By the end of the day, she had made up her mind. She picked up her phone and dialed the police non-emergency number. "This is Karen Thompson," she said with a sense of urgency. I need to report a taxi driver who harassed me earlier today. He made me feel very unsafe." The officer on the other end of the line asked her to describe what had happened. Karen exaggerated the story, making it sound as though David had been overly intrusive and threatening. She mentioned his constant staring and claimed he had asked personal questions, though in truth, David had only made polite small talk. The police took her statement seriously, as they were required to investigate all reports. They contacted the taxi company and identified David. Later that evening, David received a call from his manager asking him to come in for a meeting. David's heart sank. "Is something wrong?" he asked, concerned. "There's been a complaint, David," his manager said, his tone serious. "We need to discuss it tomorrow morning." David barely slept that night. He couldn't think of anything he might have done wrong. He prided himself on his professionalism and his reputation for being kind and respectful to all passengers. The next morning, David arrived at the office, where 2 police officers were waiting to speak with him. They informed him of Karen's complaint, leaving David stunned. "I don't understand," David said, his voice steady but confused. "I didn't do anything wrong." The officers explained that they had to investigate and that Karen's statement was taken seriously. David's taxi license was temporarily suspended while they reviewed the case. As David walked out of the office, a heavy weight settled on his chest. He felt a mix of disbelief, fear, and frustration. How could something so untrue turn his world upside down? David sat in his small living room, staring blankly at the wall. His wife, Angela, watched him from across the room, her heart heavy with worry. Their 2 children were playing quietly nearby, sensing that something was wrong. "David," Angela said gently, breaking the silence. "You've been quiet all day. What's going on?" David sighed deeply, running his hands over his face. "Angela, I don't know how to say this, but someone accused me of something I didn't do." "A passenger?" Angela's eyes widened in shock. "What kind of accusation? What happened?" David explained everything. How he had picked up the passenger, how the ride had been uneventful except for her cold attitude, and how he was now being accused of harassment. He told Angela about his suspended taxi license and the investigation. "This is crazy," Angela exclaimed. "You've always been respectful to everyone. Why would she do this?" David shook his head. "I don't know. Maybe she misunderstood something, or maybe. I don't even want to think about it." The next few days were a nightmare for David. Without his taxi license, he couldn't work, and the bills began piling up. His friends and neighbors started hearing about the accusation, and some of them began avoiding him. He noticed how people looked at him differently, some with pity, others with suspicion. David's closest friend, Marcus, stopped by one evening to check on him. "David, I heard what happened," Marcus said, his tone full of concern. "Man, this isn't like you. You're one of the most decent guys I know." "I didn't do it, Marcus," David said firmly. "I swear. But the system doesn't care about what I say. They're treating me like I'm guilty until proven innocent." Marcus nodded. "You've got to stay strong. The truth will come out. It always does." While David tried to stay hopeful, Karen's life was moving in a different direction. At first, she felt justified in making the report. She had convinced herself that her actions were necessary. But as days passed, doubts started creeping in. She replayed the ride in her mind again and again. Had she overreacted? David hadn't said anything inappropriate, but his friendliness had made her uncomfortable. Karen began to feel uneasy, but she pushed the thought aside. She told herself that she was protecting herself, that it wasn't her fault if he lost his job. However, when she went online one evening, she was shocked to see the story had started spreading on social media. "A false accusation ruins a man's life," one post read. While it didn't mention Karen's name, it described the situation in detail. People in the comments were furious, calling the accuser reckless and unfair. Karen's chest tightened. "This is getting out of hand," she muttered to herself. Back in David's home, Things were becoming harder by the day. He tried to shield his children from the stress, but they noticed the tension in the house. "Daddy, why don't you go to work anymore?" his youngest asked one evening. David's heart broke as he struggled to answer. "Daddy's just taking a little break, sweetheart," he said, forcing a smile. As he tucked his children into bed that night, David made a silent promise to fight for his name and his family's future. David felt like he was living in a bad dream. Each day, he tried to stay strong for his family, but the weight of the false accusation hung heavy on his shoulders. Bills were piling up, and the uncertainty of his future loomed over him. Despite it all, he clung to hope. He knew the truth was on his side, even if no one else seemed to believe him. Meanwhile, Karen's uneasiness was growing. Although she had convinced herself that filing the report was the right thing to do, a small voice in the back of her mind wouldn't leave her alone. Every time she saw people online discussing false accusations, it made her stomach turn. At work, Karen overheard her coworkers talking about a recent news story involving a taxi driver and an unjust accusation. She froze, her heart racing, as she realized they were talking about David's case. "This kind of thing ruins people's lives," one of her colleagues said. "Can you imagine being accused of something you didn't do?" Karen pretended not to hear them, but their words stayed with her. Unbeknownst to Karen, something significant was about to happen. A nearby building's security camera had captured David's ride with Karen. The footage, which had been overlooked during the initial investigation, showed the entire trip clearly. In the video, David was polite and professional, maintaining a respectful distance. It also showed Karen's body language, nervous and distant, but unprovoked by anything David had done. The taxi company, determined to protect its drivers and reputation, reviewed the footage and immediately provided it to the authorities. When the police saw the video, it was clear that Karen's accusations didn't match the events. One afternoon, David was at home, sitting by the window, when his phone rang. It was his manager. "David," the manager said with excitement, "the investigation has taken a turn. They found security footage from your ride with Karen. It proves you did nothing wrong." David couldn't believe his ears. "Are you serious?" he asked, his voice shaking. "Yes, David. I knew you were innocent," the manager said. "The police will contact you soon to close the case, and once they do, your taxi license will be reinstated." David thanked his manager, hanging up the phone with tears in his eyes. For the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of relief. He called Angela to share the news, and they both cried tears of joy. A few days later, Karen received a call from the police. They informed her about the security footage and the decision to drop the case against David. Karen's face turned pale as she listened. She realized there was no escaping the truth now. "You'll need to come down to the station to discuss your statement," the officer said. Karen's hands trembled as she hung up the phone. As the news spread, David's community began to rally behind him. Friends and neighbors who had doubted him started apologizing, and his family finally felt a sense of peace returning to their lives. For Karen, however, the realization of what she had done was just beginning to sink in. After the police informed Karen about the security footage, she felt a knot in her stomach. She knew the truth was out now, and she couldn't hide from it. For the first time, she truly questioned the action she had taken. She had made a choice, but now that choice seemed like a mistake. Karen decided to go to the police station to explain herself. As she walked into the building, her heart pounded. She had never been in trouble before, and this situation was overwhelming. The officer who greeted her was calm but firm. "Miss Thompson, we need to go over your statement," he said. "The security footage from the taxi ride has cleared up a lot of things. It shows that the driver, Mr. David, did nothing inappropriate." Karen nodded quietly, her face flushing with shame. The officer continued, "You've made a serious accusation against an innocent man. It's important to understand the consequences of your actions." Karen felt as if the walls were closing in around her. She had never meant for things to go this far. The reality of what she had done was harder to face than she expected. She had made a snap judgment based on her own discomfort, and now David's life was turned upside down because of it. After the meeting, Karen left the police station feeling broken. She knew she had to make things right, but she didn't know where to start. Her mind was a whirlwind of regret and fear. Meanwhile, David's life was beginning to improve. The police cleared his name, and his taxi license was reinstated. He was back at work, but things weren't the same. The neighborhood still whispered about the incident, and some people continued to look at him with suspicion. One afternoon, David's phone rang. It was a call from Karen. "Hello," David answered, his voice cautious. "David," Karen said softly. I owe you an apology." Her words were slow and filled with regret. "I made a terrible mistake, and I realize now how wrong I was to accuse you." David stayed silent for a moment, unsure of how to respond. His mind raced with all the emotions he had felt in the past few weeks. The stress, the anger, the pain, it had all been so much to carry. "I don't know what to say," David finally replied. "You ruined my life for something I didn't do. You made me look guilty when I was innocent." "I know," Karen said, her voice shaking. "I didn't think it through. I was scared and overreacted. I've seen the footage, and I understand now how wrong I was. I just wanted to say I'm sorry. I truly am." David could hear the sincerity in her voice. It wasn't easy, but he knew she was genuinely regretful. "I appreciate the apology," David said quietly, "but you can't just take back what you did. The damage is done, and it's not something I can forget easily." There was a long pause before Karen spoke again. "I understand," she said, "and I don't expect you to forgive me right away, but I will make it right. I will tell everyone I was wrong. I'll do everything I can to fix this." David nodded, though she couldn't see him. "I hope you do," he said softly, "but it's not just about me. It's about learning from this and making sure it doesn't happen to anyone else." Karen promised she would try to make amends. As she hung up the phone, she knew that her journey toward fixing the wrong she had done was just beginning. Even though David's name had been cleared, the road to recovery was far from easy. As the days passed, he went back to work driving his taxi, but it wasn't the same. The people in his community still whispered about the accusation, and some passengers looked at him with doubt when they got into his car. He could feel their eyes on him in the rearview mirror, and the silence that followed made him uneasy. David wasn't just dealing with the judgment of others. The emotional toll was harder to handle. He had always been proud of his job, proud of how he treated everyone with kindness and respect. But now, every time a passenger stepped into his taxi, he couldn't shake the feeling that they might be thinking about the false accusation. "Are they looking at me like I'm guilty?" David would wonder silently. "Are they thinking I'm the kind of man who would hurt someone?" His mind was often filled with these thoughts, making it hard for him to focus on his work. He missed the days when he could smile and chat with his passengers without second-guessing himself. At home, things were no easier. David tried to be strong for Angela and the kids, but his worries were starting to show. Angela noticed the change in him, the way he seemed lost in his thoughts or distracted while helping the kids with homework. She knew he was trying to hide it, but she could see the weight of the situation on his shoulders. One evening, after the kids had gone to bed, Angela sat down beside him on the couch. "David, I know this whole thing has been hard on you, but you're not alone in this. We're a family. We'll get through it together." David looked at her, his eyes filled with uncertainty. "I don't know, Angela. Sometimes it feels like I'll never get my old life back. The damage has been done, and people, they still think the worst of me." Angela took his hand, her grip firm. "Don't let them win. The truth is on your side, and you've got us. We'll rebuild, one step at a time." David appreciated her words, but deep down, he still felt like something was missing. He didn't feel the same connection with his community anymore. The respect he had once felt from others seemed lost. One day, as he drove through the city, He noticed a group of people standing on the corner, holding signs that read, "Support the truth," and "Stand against false accusations." His heart skipped a beat as he realized they were standing up for him. He had never asked for their support, but they were doing it anyway. It was a small gesture, but it meant the world to David. He parked his taxi nearby and walked over to thank them. A young woman holding a sign approached him. "Mr. David, we just wanted to let you know that we believe in you. We know you didn't do anything wrong. You don't deserve what happened to you." David felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It means a lot to me. More than you know." As he walked back to his taxi, a sense of peace settled in his chest. It wasn't much, but it was a start. People were beginning to see him for who he really was, not the man Karen had accused him of being, but the man he truly was, a hard-working, honest father and husband. David knew it would take time, but he was determined to keep moving forward. He had his family's support, and now he had the support of people who believed in him. He wasn't going to let a false accusation define who he was. As the days passed, Karen couldn't escape the feeling of guilt that hung over her like a dark cloud. She tried to continue with her daily life, but everything felt off. The once simple things, like going to work or meeting her friends for coffee, now felt uncomfortable. Her mind kept going back to David and the false accusation she had made. At first, Karen had convinced herself that she had done the right thing. She thought she was protecting herself, that she had made the right call in reporting David. But now, seeing the damage she had caused, she realized how wrong she was. The thought of how David's life had been turned upside down because of her made her stomach churn. Every time she saw someone mention the case on social media or in the news, her guilt grew. People were now talking about her mistake, some of them blaming her for ruining David's career. It wasn't just strangers who were upset. Even some of her friends began distancing themselves from her. They didn't say it directly, but Karen could feel their judgment. One afternoon, while she was sitting alone in her apartment, Karen found herself scrolling through the news about David. There were articles about how the taxi company had reinstated his license and how the police had cleared his name. She felt a knot tighten in her chest as she read the words, knowing that she was the reason David had gone through all of this. Karen took a deep breath and decided it was time to face the truth. She couldn't hide from what she had done. She needed to make things right, or at least try, but she didn't know where to begin. She picked up the phone and dialed the number for David's taxi company. After a few rings, the manager answered. "Hello, this is Tom," the manager said. "Hi, this is Karen Thompson," she said, her voice shaky. "I need to speak to David. I've been thinking a lot about what happened, and I need to apologize to him." Tom paused, surprised by her call. "I'll let him know you're trying to reach him. He's been through a lot, but I'm sure he'd want to hear from you." Karen thanked him and hung up the phone. She sat in silence for a moment, wondering if David would even want to speak to her. After everything she had done, it seemed almost impossible for him to forgive her. But she had to try. A few hours later, David's phone rang. He looked at the caller ID and saw that it was Karen. For a moment, he hesitated. After everything that had happened, he wasn't sure if he was ready to talk to her, but he knew he couldn't avoid it forever. He answered the call. "David," Karen's voice came through, sounding soft and full of regret. "I know I don't have the right to ask for your forgiveness, but I need to say how truly sorry I am. I ruined your life with my lie, and I'll never be able to undo the harm I caused. But please know that I deeply regret what I did." David stayed quiet for a moment. The anger and hurt he had felt over the past few weeks hadn't completely disappeared, but hearing her apology felt like the first step toward healing. He wasn't sure if he could forgive her right away, but he knew he had to listen. "I appreciate your apology, Karen," David said slowly. "But you have to understand, the damage you caused isn't something I can just forget. It's going to take time." Karen nodded on the other end of the phone, her voice barely above a whisper. "I understand. I just wanted to say that I'll do whatever I can to make it right. I'll tell everyone the truth. I'll tell them I was wrong." David felt a sense of relief, but he still wasn't ready to completely let go of the hurt. "That's a start," he said. "But it's not just about words. It's about action. I hope you'll take responsibility for what you did. And not just to me, but to everyone who's been affected by this." Karen agreed, promising to make things right in every way she could. As the call ended, David didn't feel completely healed, but he felt like a small weight had been lifted. Maybe, just maybe, this was the first step toward real change for both of them. After her call to David, Karen spent the following days reflecting deeply on everything that had happened. The weight of her actions still hung heavily on her. She knew that apologizing over the phone wasn't enough. She needed to do more to fix the damage she had caused. Karen started by reaching out to the police department. She asked to meet with an officer to explain the truth of the situation. She wanted to make it clear that the harassment accusations she had made against David were false, and she had been wrong to ever say such things. The officer agreed to meet with her, and Karen sat down at the station, preparing to take responsibility for her mistake. "I made a terrible mistake," Karen admitted as she spoke to the officer. "I accused a man of something he didn't do, and I want to make sure everyone knows the truth." The officer listened carefully, nodding. "It's good that you're taking responsibility for this. It's important for the public to understand that false accusations can harm innocent people. What you're doing now is a step toward making things right." Karen felt a small sense of relief, but she knew that her journey wasn't over. The apology to David had been necessary, but it was only a part of the bigger picture. She needed to take action to fix things beyond just saying the words. Her next step was contacting the taxi company. She spoke to the manager, telling him again how sorry she was for everything she had caused. "I know I can't change what happened," she said, "but I'd like to help make sure this doesn't affect David any longer. I'm willing to do anything that can help him get back to his life without the shadow of this mistake." The manager was surprised by her sincerity. "We appreciate your words, Karen. I'm sure David will be glad to know you're taking action. But actions speak louder than words, so if you're serious about fixing this, you'll need to show that you're doing more than just apologizing." Karen nodded, understanding the challenge ahead of her. "I will. I'm going to tell the community what happened and make sure everyone knows the truth. I'll do whatever I can to make it right." As she hung up, Karen began to think about how she could use her mistake as a lesson. She decided to speak publicly about her actions and raise awareness about the harm caused by false accusations. She realized that if she wanted to truly make amends, she had to speak up and make sure others understood the damage caused by her false report. A week later, Karen held a press conference. She stood in front of the reporters, her hands shaking slightly, but her voice steady. "I want to begin by saying that I made a mistake, one that hurt an innocent man and his family," she said. "I falsely accused David of something he didn't do, and I deeply regret that. I want to apologize to him, to his family, and to everyone who was affected by my actions." The room was quiet as she spoke. She continued, "I want to raise awareness about the dangers of making false accusations, especially when it comes to harassment. We all need to take a step back and think before we speak or act. I was wrong, and I will spend the rest of my life making sure this never happens again." The response was mixed. Some people admire her honesty, while others criticize her for waiting so long to take responsibility. But Karen knew that she had done the right thing. She was ready to face the consequences of her actions, no matter how difficult. Meanwhile, David's life was slowly returning to normal. He was back to driving his taxi, and his community was beginning to trust him again. The scars of the false accusation would never fully disappear, but with Karen's public apology, the journey toward healing had begun for both of them. Weeks passed after Karen's public apology, and things slowly started to settle down for both her and David. It wasn't easy, and the road to healing had been long, but they both had learned important lessons about responsibility, truth, and the power of action. David was doing better. He had his taxi license back, and while some people in his community still whispered behind his back, the support he had received from those who believed in him kept him going. He'd heard from some of his old passengers, many of whom apologized for doubting him, and that helped to rebuild his trust in others. But David knew that the scars from this experience would never fully go away. The hardest part was that, even though he was innocent, the accusation would always be a part of his past. He had to learn how to live with it, while also moving forward. He focused on his family and his work, slowly finding his way back to the life he had once known. Angela stood by him through it all, reminding him that their family was strong, and together, they could face anything. "We've come through the storm, David," she would say. "We'll be even stronger on the other side." Meanwhile, Karen had been doing everything she could to make things right. Her public apology had been just the beginning. She had spent time volunteering with local organizations that helped people who had been wrongly accused of crimes, using her own experience to raise awareness about the harm false accusations could cause. It wasn't easy, but Karen was determined to do something positive with the second chance she had been given. One afternoon, Karen reached out to David again. This time, it wasn't just to apologize. She wanted to offer something more, something she hoped would make up for the damage she had done. "David," she said when he answered the phone, "I've been thinking a lot about how I can make this right. I know I can never take away the hurt I caused, but I'd like to help you in some way, if you'll allow me." David listened quietly. He still hadn't fully forgiven Karen, but he appreciated that she was trying to make a difference. "What do you mean?" he asked. "I'd like to donate to a charity in your name," Karen said. "One that supports families who've been affected by false accusations. I know it's not much, but it's a way for me to try and make a positive impact." David was silent for a moment. He hadn't expected such a gesture, and it touched him more than he could express. That's kind of you," he finally said. "Thank you." Karen's voice softened. "I know it's a small step, but I want to help however I can. I've learned a lot from this experience, and I just hope it can make a difference for someone else." As David hung up the phone, he felt a mix of emotions. The anger he had felt earlier had started to fade, replaced by a sense of understanding. He knew that Karen's actions couldn't undo the pain she had caused, but her willingness to take responsibility and make a change showed that she had truly learned from her mistake. In the end, both David and Karen had been through a difficult journey. They had faced the consequences of their actions, learned important lessons, and grown stronger because of it. It wasn't easy, but it was a reminder of how important it was to take responsibility for one's actions, to speak the truth, and to show accountability, even when it's hard. For David, life had begun to feel normal again. He had his family, his job, and a renewed sense of hope for the future. As for Karen, she had finally found a way to make amends, understanding that actions would always speak louder than words. And so, life went on. David kept driving his taxi, offering a friendly smile to every passenger who entered his car, and Karen continued to do the work she had promised, sharing her story and teaching others the lessons she had learned the hard way. In the end, they both found a way to heal, and in doing so, they helped others to do the same.